The dust rose before the gunfire did. 5 SEALs crouched behind shattered walls, their breath shallow, their faces painted with sweat and grit. Out in the open, an enemy force moved with confidence, dozens of rifles glinting under the merciless Afghan Sunday. The numbers told the story plainly. This was no fight to win. It was a fight to last as long as possible. And then, in the stillness between bursts of fire, a single shot cracked through the air, sharp, surgical, final. One enemy fighter fell, then another. Confusion rippled through the enemy ranks. None of the SEALs had fired. They all turned the same thought in their minds: someone else is here. The sniper had been there all along, unseen, waiting. Hidden in the jagged cliffs above, eyes pressed against a scope, heart steady as stone. The enemy never knew his name. The SEALs had barely glimpsed his face. But on that day, he was the line between life and death. He was called Mason Kane. To strangers, he looked like any man shaped by years of hard work, broad-shouldered, lean, and quiet. But those who knew his history carried it with reverence. Once, he had worn the trident on his chest. Once, he had been the one outnumbered, surrounded, the last voice on the radio as his brothers fell around him. For him, every mission carried ghosts. The scent of burned metal never quite left his memory. The thrum of helicopter rotors still echoed in his ears at night. But Mason never spoke of it. His silence was his shield, his way of carrying the weight without burdening others. He lived quietly after the Navy, working long hours in solitude, avoiding crowds, avoiding recognition. Yet, when the call came, when the younger SEALs found themselves pinned and betrayed by numbers, he answered without hesitation. The enemy held high ground. The SEALs were cornered in the ruins of a desert village, their radios scrambled, their extraction delayed. The world would never know their names if they died here. They would vanish into statistics, swallowed by the desert. The injustice was suffocating. The enemy jeered openly, emboldened by their numbers, closing the noose with laughter and taunts that carried across the sand. The villagers who watched from doorways remained silent, afraid to intervene. They averted their eyes, as though pretending not to see would save them from retribution. It was this silence, this crushing absence of dignity, that burned inside Mason's chest. The SEALs did not beg. They did not surrender. They crouched, their bodies battered but unbroken, waiting for the inevitable storm. And in their waiting, they carried a truth that no jeer, no bullet, no overwhelming force could erase. They would never be shamed. But Mason Kane had seen enough men die quiet deaths in the dust. Not today. He shifted his rifle, breath slow, finger light on the trigger. His world shrank to a circle of glass and crosshairs. He whispered to no one but himself, a vow he had carried for years. A man's silence is not his weakness, it is his strength waiting to be heard. The first shot rang out. A leader fell. The enemy hesitated. Another shot, another fall. Confusion spread like wildfire. The desert that had seemed so safe for the enemy was suddenly a killing ground they could not control. The SEALs lifted their heads in disbelief. For the first time in hours, the rhythm of battle shifted in their favor. The weight pressing down on their lungs began to lift. Mason fired and faded, shifting position after every shot. He was a phantom in the cliffs, unseen, untouchable. Each bullet was precise, chosen not just to wound but to unmake the enemy's confidence. They no longer laughed. They no longer advanced. They turned on each other, shouting, pointing to shadows that weren't there. The SEALs rose from behind their cover with renewed fire. They didn't need to know who watched over them. They only needed to feel the tide turning. Together, they surged back against impossible odds, each step fueled by the knowledge that they were not alone. The battle became a study in silence and fear. For every mocking taunt the enemy had shouted earlier, now there was only hesitation. For every arrogant step forward, now there was retreat. And in the midst of it all, the hidden sniper remained unseen, his presence felt only through the sudden collapse of those who thought themselves invincible. When the dust settled, when the last echoes of rifles faded into the mountains, 5 SEALs still stood, battered, scarred, but alive. Their eyes swept the cliffs, searching for the ghost who had saved them. But Mason Kane had already gone, leaving only footprints in stone and the faint scent of rifle oil carried on the wind. Later, in quiet moments, when the SEALs told the story among themselves, they spoke of that day in hushed tones. They spoke of a man they had never fully seen, but whose actions had written their survival. They remembered the silence before the first shot, and the silence after the last. One of them put it into words that stayed with all of them. Sometimes the bravest voices are the ones that never speak, only act. Mason never asked for thanks. He never appeared in official reports. His name was not recorded in briefings or written into medals. To the world, the story was just another battle. But to the men whose lives had been measured in seconds, Mason Kane was the reason they walked away. And perhaps that was enough. For Mason, silence had always been his chosen weapon, not to hide, but to remind the world that honor does not need applause and sacrifice does not need recognition. The story of Mason Kane became more than a battle tale. It became a reminder whispered through barracks and memorial halls. A man is not measured by the noise he makes in life, but by the lives that are quietly safe because of him. So when you hear of SEALs outnumbered, when you imagine the heat and dust of that day, remember the man in the cliffs, the one who carried the weight of memory and loss, yet chose to stand unseen for others. His silence was not emptiness. It was power, it was defiance, it was love. And perhaps that is the lesson for us all. Respect is not owed to the loudest voice in the room, but to the quiet strength that holds the line when no one else can. If this story moved you, share where you're watching from. Tell us what you think of men like Mason Kane, whose silence spoke louder than words. And if you believe more people should hear stories of honor, resilience, and unseen sacrifice, subscribe, because silent heroes deserve to be remembered.